Welcome to the Ivy Impact ESG Series. My name is Matthew Lynch with the Centre for Building Sustainable Value here at Ivy. I will be your host and moderator for today's session. Ivy Impact Live events are intended for leaders like you to challenge perspectives, inspire new ideas, and ignite innovation. In our first event a few weeks ago, we explored the current state of play of ESG for business and finance, both developments and controversies, to help leaders make sense of this agenda. Our second session today is a deep dive into one of the most critical developments, the move towards standardized sustainability disclosures internationally and here in Canada. This is an important moment for this discussion in general, but particularly because the consultation period for the draft Canadian standards is live at the moment and will close shortly. So more on that later. Why are standards so important? As we discussed in session one, there is a broad consensus among investors that sustainability issues, including climate change, biodiversity loss, and growing social inequity, not only represent systemic risks to the economy and society overall, but are now material to firm valuation and investment decision-making. But what information should investors use to allocate capital? This is where there has been an ongoing challenge, because while there has been a profusion of different sustainability reporting frameworks and standards producing information, often referred to as an alphabet soup given the prevalence of acronyms, the lack of standardized, comparable, and decision-relevant information appears to remain a barrier. The International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, was established with the goal of tackling this challenge, bringing together a number of existing reporting and disclosure initiatives. It is also housed within the IFRS Foundation, the leading international developer of financial reporting standards, to maximize the alignment with financial reporting. The ISSB reached a major milestone with the publication of its first two standards last year. Our first guest speaker is right at the heart of this critical global process as one of the members of the ISSB board. Michael Janci is in many ways a key pioneer in this space, growing the firm he established, Sustainalytics, to become one of the world's leading providers of ESG research and ratings for the investment community. Michael was also a board member of the Values Reporting Foundation and for many years was a member of our own Ivy Sustainability Advisory Council. Welcome, Michael. The related development for the Canadian context has been the establishment of the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, or CSSB. The CSSB was established in June 2023 to advance the adoption of sustainability disclosure standards in Canada. The CSSB uses the ISSB standards, but with modifications to serve the Canadian public interest. So we are also privileged today to have another leader at the centre of the standardisation process in Canada as part of our discussion. Lisa French is Vice President, Sustainability Standards at Financial Reporting and Assurance Standards Canada, which is the body within the Canadian accounting profession supporting the work of the CSSB. Lisa has a long and distinguished career in sustainability and sustainability standards development. Welcome, Lisa. And to further help make sense of this area, I'm very happy to be joined by my colleague, Nadine Degan. Nadine is a faculty member in both the sustainability and accounting groups here at Ivy. Her research interests encompass the integration of ESG metrics into executive compensation, internal control systems, and organisational culture. She is also a passionate educator and has been program director of our undergrad HBA program here at Ivy for the last 3 years. We want to thank the audience members that shared questions when they registered. These were very helpful in shaping today's discussion. And we also want to note that there is an opportunity to submit questions through the Q&A function in today's session. So before we make a start on our panel discussion, we're going to actually pose a question to our audience. So what we want to ask you is we want to get a sense of what best describes your interest in sustainability disclosure standards. Are you a user of disclosure information, so an investor? Perhaps a reporter, preparer of information, such as a reporting company? an advisor or consultant supporting others to report or analyze information, or D, just curious? So please, if you could sort of fill out that poll, what best describes your interest in these standards? Just give it a few seconds for people to complete the poll. Okay. Let's see the results. Okay, interesting. So we have a sort of covering the full breadth, which doesn't surprise me for these Ivy audiences. We have investors, we have reporting companies. We also have our biggest category there is those in the sort of consulting advisory space, which is not surprising given that that's where a lot of Ivy alums end up, and a lot of curiosity, which we love at a business school. We love people to be curious. Okay, so let's move to our discussion. The first part, we want to sort of just check in on this idea of the rationale for the importance of standardization. So I want to ask perhaps a first question to you, Lisa. Why is it so important to have standardized information about firms' sustainability, risk, and performance?
Oh, you're asking a standards nerd a standardization question, and I love it. So I think from an investor standpoint, I think the case is a quick and probably very obvious one. I mean, standardization drives that comparability and that consistency in what and how companies disclose, not just in Canada, of course, but across jurisdictions. And I think that consistency of approach drives better investment decisions. So I know I'm kind of sounding like a little bit university textbooky here, but that part of it I don't think is rocket science. I'm personally a little bit more interested, I suppose, on the other side of the equation, the preparer or the issuer or company side of the equation, because I think that's where it gets very compelling. I mean, there's something to be said for having the same playbook as your industry peers. And I know it sounds a little bit cliche, and I know I've said this repeatedly, but having that level playing field brings companies a sense of relief. And we've heard as much from companies. So yes, there will be some growing pains in the near term, and we've certainly heard those loudly and clearly. But some companies are now beginning to move beyond the reporting burden arguments and recognizing that bigger picture reality that, okay, we need to get on with the show and have a clear set of requirements. Ideally, those would be standardized across the board, so they would be applicable to all, so that no company is or group of companies is put at a disadvantage. So I've kind of tried to tackle both sides of that equation on the importance of standardization.
Excellent, thank you, Lisa. That's something we're going to sort of unpack a bit more later in the conversation. Nadine, what are your thoughts here?
I have a couple of them. I'll be quick with. Just how much also supports once we have a standard set of disclosure guidelines. There's going to be standard setting in assurance and audit and so many other fields of quality assurance in this space. And when you think of how much that all collectively serves market, society from the information perspective, I say it often enough in teaching governance, that we so rely on sunlight being the best disinfectant for our markets and society, that there are expectations about information and what role it serves. And I think something else it attaches to that I don't ever lose sight of is like trust in companies, trust in markets. And we've seen so much data in the last few years that there's been a decline in trust in our corporations in North America, and a trend we're seeing somewhat more globally. So if we can just even get this right, then building the trust building mechanism that comes out of a transparency foundation will just be bolstered, is my thinking on that.
Yeah. Okay. No, thank you, Nadine. Wonderful and insightful observations as always. Michael, before the ISSB, we did have a number of very well-developed, well-designed disclosure and reporting frameworks, the CSSB standards, which you were very directly involved with, TCFD, the CDP standards. Why was that sort of previous regime not meeting the needs of investors?
Well, it's a good question, and I'm going to give us a very quick history of the changes we've seen in the interest from an investment perspective in sustainability disclosure. And it's going to touch on some of the things that you said, Matthew, in your introduction, and then Lisa and Nadine talked about. But my time frame or reference points for this go back about 35 years. And so when I started in the sustainable finance space, working with investors, and there weren't a lot of them that were particularly interested in looking at sustainability data or information as part of their investment process. But that changed, and it picked up momentum through the 1990s and the early 2000s, and investors became interested in sustainability data, I would argue, because they felt it could enhance insights into the decisions, and that information then was helping them make decisions that were in the best interest of their plan members or other clients. I would say that sort of in 2006, which was the founding of the Principles for Responsible Investment, I think it recognized two things. First of all, that at that point, sustainability information was a nice to have for investors. Again, it added context and information to that process, but it also, from my perspective, acted as a catalyst. So, we had a deepening and a broadening of integration of sustainability issues into the investment process. But when the PRI was formed and there was this, global, organization that was focused on these issues, we saw the deepening of that integration of sustainability issues into the investment process by investors around the world. And somewhere along the line, what I think happened is we saw investors looking at sustainable information, that shift from a nice to have to a need to have. And it's probably not important to put a particular date on this, but from my perspective, I think it really, a catalyst for that shift from nice to have to need to have was Mark Carney's Tragedy of the Commons speech in September of 2015, when he talked about climate risks and the acute risk to not just the global economy, but to companies and to investment portfolios. That changed the tenor of the conversation. And in capital markets, when something becomes a need to have, what was once fit for purpose is no longer fit for purpose. So all of these disclosure regimes that you mentioned, and there were a plethora of others you described as an alphabet soup, were no longer fit for purpose. And what was happening was that on the investor side, it was talked about, investors are saying, the quality of this data isn't good enough, for what we need it to do now. It's not comparable across jurisdictions. It's not assured. It's not verified. Companies, and Lisa talked about this, were equally as frustrated. It was costly. It was inefficient for them to try and manage this alphabet soup of disclosure standards. And this landed on the radar screen of IOSCO, which is the umbrella organization for securities regulators around the world, which then put it on, again, in the sights of the IFRS Foundation that you mentioned, Matthew. And so, again, before the IFRS Foundation decided to launch the ISSB, they went out to the market for an extensive consultation, and they heard all of these things come back, again, from investors, from preparers, and other stakeholders across the capital market. The current alphabet soup was not fit for purpose. They needed high quality, comparable, aligned global standards that were assurable and verifiable. So, those are the themes you've already heard today. Those are the things that spurred the IFRS Foundation to make the decision to launch the ISSB, which they did at COP26.
Yeah. Okay. Fabulous. Michael, that's a great sort of segue now into looking at the work of the ISSB. Perhaps the first question was the one on, and as you sort of established in that sort of in that context, this is very much a conversation on information for investors and financial markets. Was that always going to be what ISSB focused on, or did you consider sort of meeting the needs of a wider set of stakeholders in the sort of foundational discussions on your work?
Well, I don't think it should be a surprise to anybody that as soon as this landed within the IFRS Foundation, that our focus was going to be on the same primary users, investors and other allocators of capital, that the IFRS Foundation, its predecessors, had used for years. I mean, if you think about the globalization of financial standards, that process started in 1973. I mean, Canada was very instrumental in that led to the International Accounting Standards. And then in 2001, the formation of the International Accounting Standards Board. So, we are a sister board to the IASB. We share the mission of the foundation and the IASB, provide decision useful information for investors. And that's information that they need to evaluate the sustainability risks and opportunities that can be impactful to an entity's prospects over the short, medium, and long term. So it is that financial materiality perspective. It's completely aligned with the mission of the IASB and the foundation. So no, I don't think there should have been an expectation it was going to broaden. At the same time, though, there had been, I think this is dissipated, there had been this feeling that the ISSB didn't recognize that some investors do have a need for sustainability information beyond just that financial materiality. We've long recognized that. We just felt it wasn't our mission. And so we're here to build a global baseline of sustainability disclosures. And what we do know is there's a common information need for investors. So no matter what else they might be looking for, all investors want that financial materiality focused disclosure. And that's what is a major component of our global baseline. We're very comfortable with building blocks off of that. And you can see by, again, the interoperability measures and endeavors and initiatives we've taken with Europe, which has a broader mandate, the recent announcement in our deepening of relationship with the Global Reporting Initiative. We're very interested in interoperability, that seamless reporting. Our focus, though, is on financial materiality, as we know best. And lastly, Matthew, there's some just practical application for this. Remember, we're moving from a voluntary reporting environment to a mandatory reporting environment in jurisdictions around the world. And that means assurance and auditing. And the fact is, from a financial materiality perspective and sustainability risks and opportunities, we're on a learning curve. Taking that to the impact side is, a greater distance out. So those are some of the things that underpinned, our focus on the financial materiality side of things.
Yes, yeah, and maybe sort of continuing that line of inquiry. So the first two standards published last year focused on sort of general sustainability disclosures and climate sustainability disclosures. One thing that I noticed immediately, sort of looking at the new standards, was their use of the TCFD as the sort of core sort of framing and logic to the standards development, not just on the climate side, but on the general side as well. Can you maybe talk to why that was such a sort of useful framework as the foundation for your work?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of reasons. And I mean, you mentioned, again, maybe a key one right off the top in your introductory remarks is that there was this alphabet soup we talked about for investors, preparers. It was just not working anymore. So certainly we had no intention of adding another letter to that alphabet soup. We wanted to do the opposite. And so, from the get-go, the ISSB looked at what other frameworks, disclosure regimes were out there that were focused on providing decision useful information for investors. And you mentioned the fact that the IFRS Foundation brought the Value Reporting Foundation in, the SASB standards, integrated reporting framework. It brought the Climate Disclosure Standards Board work in. So right from day one, we started that consolidation. But the TCFD is the core architecture of both S1 and S2, as you mentioned, in large part because that structure of governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets works so well. But it was built for investors, and investors clearly found it useful, because if you look at jurisdictions around the world, including Canada, there was a significant number of preparers that were using the TCFD recommendations as a framework for reporting on climate-related risks and opportunities, and investors liked it. So that relationship started, from day one, actually pre-day one, to the formation of the ISSB board, because it was useful and it was part of the consolidation process. And as you know, it was almost a year ago now that the TCFD announced that it was sort of sunsetting, folding into the ISSB. So we're very proud of the fact now that we are the standard setting legacy of the TCFD.
Excellent, great. Nadine, I'd like to bring you in here. Some initial thoughts on Michael's setup.
I I was probably going to hit Michael with this question a little bit later on even, but now is as good a time. When the first conversations around this extraordinary convergence project, which I am very excited about, let me say that, even while I hold a critical accounting view on things, there was a sense of GRI feeling absent in the sort of early, or at least not as present as, as seeing the Climate Disclosure Standards Board excited to roll in. And you mentioned, Michael, there just interoperability, and I'm excited to see so much more information coming out now about how similar S1, S2 will be with GRI 305 or GRI 105, all of these. That was a comforting document to read. And I'm just maybe even curious to throw it back to Michael around how genuine, because I worried that there was something there was friction there that you couldn't observe as an outsider, but maybe there isn't. And maybe if there was, it no longer is. And even while the ISSB maintains a different definition of materiality vis-a-vis GRI and their particular standard setting body. So my response is a question just as well, I think, of having the opportunity to hear from you here on whether that is as promising as I hope it to be.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I can't speak for the Global Reporting Initiative, but it's been around for 25 years. You have thousands of companies around the world that are using it. And so the ISSB is sort of the new kid on the block in a sense. There maybe was some concern about that. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is that right from the beginning, and I think it was March 2022, there was a memorandum of understanding signed between the two organizations. But, GRI was going through its own governance issues and changes. The ISSB was launching and was, we were focused on making sure that we were creating S1 and S2 at this high quality. So we were both very much focused on doing what we needed to do, but there was always, I think, goodwill and good communication from the very highest levels of the organization down to the technical staff. So, we're beyond that now. We're looking at, really a hard turn to adoption in some ways. And, those relationships now are very much strengthening. So I think it's quite exciting, again, that we're going to be continuing to work on this interoperability. We're going to cooperate on finding where there's alignment in regards to sustainability risks and opportunities in the two sets of standards. From my perspective, it's really exciting that we have a particular project to work on, because I always think in learning to work with one another and build trust with another organization, you have specific projects. And so, in our agenda consultation, we highlighted the fact that biodiversity, ecosystem, and ecosystem services is going to be something we'll explore now from a research phase. And we'll be working very closely with Global Reporting Initiative, with GRI, in doing that. But, I think, a lesson I learned a long time ago, you have to have two willing dance partners, right? It's less effective with just one. And so that's not putting the blame on either one of us. It's just sometimes the events have to happen. The timing needs to be right to come together in that way. And I think, the timing now is right for a number of different reasons. So I'm quite excited. There's an ISSB response. I'm going to give you my personal perspective. I think that the recent announcement, I think it was on May 24th, which talks about deepening the MOU. I think it's much more powerful than that because in large part now we have a tangible project that we can work on together and learn how to work together, how to build trust, and how this might look going forward.
Wonderful.
Lovely. I'm happy. I'm excited by that answer. Thank you.
Excellent. Let's now move to the localization of international standards. And this is where we sort of segue to the work of the CSSB. Lisa, maybe as a sort of starting question, why is it important to have essentially a local Canadian version of the work that the ISSB is doing?
Yeah, so I mean, when we talk of local or Canadian versions of these standards, we're talking about standards that have been issued by the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, or CSSB, and those standards are known as Canadian Sustainability Disclosure Standards, or CSDSs. So a lot of acronyms, I know, but so in the case of the first two standards that will soon be finalized by the CSSB, those are out for public comment now. There's my public promotion of the consultation period. We're talking about, the global baseline standards developed by the ISSB with some proposed tweaks to the timing of implementation for all intents and purposes. So a few additional transition reliefs given to Canadian companies that would give them some extra time to build their capacity and so on. So I do want to underscore, though, that the disclosure requirements themselves, they remain intact. And that goes to my earlier point on the value of standardization. So getting to more directly to your question, the importance of CSSB issued standards is that the Canadian market will know that a Canadian body has vetted the international standards for their fitness for purpose in Canada. And a Canadian body has tested any departures or proposed modifications with the Canadian public. And so therein lies the value. So I know my preamble was a little bit longer than my actual response, but I just wanted to contextualize my response there.
Yes, yeah. And a sort of follow-up question. So one of the things that you're looking at is the sort of the development of the standards or modification based on sort of Canadian public interest. One area that's come up is the issue of reconciliation and Indigenous rights. Is this something you see being part of the Canadianization of the international standards?
Yeah, so it is exceptionally early days at this stage, but I'm going to offer some insight into some of the board's thinking, maybe kind of even tying into one of the points that Michael made earlier in terms of, the building, the baseline and building blocks, right? So there's opportunities to sort of capture Canadian nuance, Canadian, unique public interest considerations as part of a building block component, or could be part of guidance that would accompany the standards in terms of interpretation. I don't know what any of it looks like because, again, we're in early stages. But I will say that the area that you've raised is absolutely top of mind. So safeguarding the rights of Indigenous peoples in particular is a top of mind consideration for the CSSB. And to that end, the board has actually made a public commitment in its two exposure drafts. You'll see a preamble in both of the exposure drafts. And that commitment is to collaborate with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples to explore how to best address these rights in the context of Canadian sustainability disclosure standards. And the board will most certainly consider this area as it develops its multi-year strategic plan, which it's embarking on, kind of as we speak. And those discussions could lead to some important refinements to the CSSB's standard setting process. So the way it, develops standards, or it could have disclosure implications, or both of those things.
Yes. Yeah. Nadine, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. I know that this is an issue or an agenda that you've thought about deeply and tackled in some of the work that you've done.
Yeah, so and Lisa knows something of my, I won't call it frustration, but maybe a reaction sometimes to how, in the first instance, an overplaying of a localization, not respective to our Indigenous conversation, that I do consider to be a pillar, independent of what I think is sometimes an overplayed worry of a need to localize international standards. And we're talking about 140 jurisdictions that have, picked up IFRS. And I remember studying that trajectory even through my PhD and looking at how we got where you had countries that changed constitutions. Brazil was an example of that. And I know Brazil even more just recently in looking at ISSB standards. So just, I guess, what I find a sobering thought is to remind ourselves that there are many economies that have, many nations that have sectors similar to Canada. And so that there is, we're not absent of examples of the ways that international standards get picked up, and perhaps not to feel like there's something that, or maybe I never want us to think that we have to spend a whole lot of time making changes. The idea of comparability needs certainly to be retained. And a different sobering thought, of course, is the different histories in particular countries as it relates to Indigenous peoples. And it's been, I'm from Trinidad, for example, very different history of Indigenous peoples in our country, in our region generally. And I know very much that's that would shape very differently how we would think about having these conversations. And I can sense that in the way I hear about it from Australia. So it's just sometimes more nuanced to understanding what localization means for a place. And I think Lisa captured it very nicely in talking about how consultation might even, that would be something, perhaps, if I'm interpreting you correctly, Lisa, that we would have to visit, because it comes from a history that we did not necessarily have Indigenous participation in when we're building out those kinds of consultation processes. And because we're bringing ourselves to an awareness of who was absent, when long traditions of consultation were built, it is an opportunity to open ourselves back up to, well, where could we, always thinking through how could we be better? Because when we bring that much rich, deep thought to a process, I believe, I'm painfully optimistic that we build more robust and more inclusive systems of thinking.
Yes.
Oh, that was awesome. That wasn't even a question. It was a bunch of things I could agree with. So,
Michael, I know that the ISSB has been very thoughtful about thinking about how these standards are adopted locally. If you could maybe talk a little bit to how you're approaching that.
Yeah, and I will concur with Lisa and in my agreement with Nadine, your comments there. I think that, if you look at the consultation we went through at the ISSB in regards to what has informed S1 and S2, the count is now more than 30,000 stakeholder interactions. So what you see in the standards is informed significantly by investors, preparers, and other stakeholders. But we recognize the fact that the adoption of these standards is a jurisdictional focus. It's not like we can't force the adoption of these standards in any country, but it's why we're focusing on the global baseline, that there is if you look at the history of standards in Canada on the financial reporting side, and Lisa sort of touched on this, our history is we are a taker of international standards because it's been in our public interest here. It's been in the interest of the robustness and competitiveness of our capital markets. And, again, we have a standard setting structure in Canada that is well respected around the world because of the independence of that standard setter. The accounting standards board here, the public sector accounting standards board, they're well respected. Standard setters set standards create standards that are in the public interest. And again, in Canada, that has been taking those global standards, and then securities regulators enforce them. That's the way it's worked here. It's worked well, and we're respected because of it. And again, one would expect that would work well in the case of sustainability disclosure standards. So, for me, when we're talking, I completely agree with what Nadine, what you said, is that we can almost weaponize this idea of regional or local perspectives. And I think if we remember that, the global alignment, and Lisa talked about this, is so important to both investors and preparers. But again, from an ISSB perspective, this construct of building blocks works on that global baseline nicely. And, I was on the independent review committee for standard setting in Canada. We talked about, it was the body that recommended for the formation of the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board. right from that point, we talked about the importance of, Indigenous issues, to put it broadly, in regards to standard setting in Canada. And while Indigenous issues, I can argue, are incorporated into the ISSB standards, we have, Jordy Hungerford is an advisor on these issues to our chair, Emmanuel Faber. But, certainly in Canada, and I would argue in other jurisdictions around the world, it's not just Canada, maybe these issues hold a greater degree of prominence. They may have a greater exposure to risks and opportunities around these issues. That is a perfect example of a potential building block. So that's how the ISSB sort of views this, I think, within this broader context.
Yes,
Matthew,
Lisa.
can I squeeze in a
Yes,
perfect,
please.
thanks. I just wanted to squeeze in a reaction there to why Indigenous rights is even on the radar screen of the CSSB, independent of its own thinking. I do want to note that this isn't a body that's acting in isolation. It's something that we have heard from the market in terms of, I remember when we were responding to the ISSB's agenda priorities consultation, and we did a range of roundtables, consultation roundtables. And in the context of the proposed ISSB research project on human rights, I mean, our questions were open-ended. There was no steering. It was the market who said, yes, human rights. Let's talk of Indigenous rights. Let's talk of UNDRIP. Let's talk of obtaining free, prior, and informed consent. So I do want our audience to recognize this is not the CSSB decreeing from on high, well, this is what we need to focus on. We're hearing this is part of the Canadian sentiment.
Yeah. So maybe, Lisa, to sort of just wrap up this part of our discussion, a sort of pragmatic sort of question. What is the sort of feedback that you're wanting to see from stakeholders in the consultation? And just a quick note, we will send information as a follow-up email this afternoon so people can find the link to the CSSB consultation. But what are the things you're looking to get from the feedback you're looking to receive?
Okay, so I'm going to summarize because I'm not sure that we've even talked on some of the decision-making piece of this. So I'm going to explain to the audience what's actually out there, because it's not just the two standards that are out as exposure drafts. So the first document that we have is called a criteria for modification framework. And as clunky as that title sounds, it really does sort of get to the heart of the CSSB's decision-making process. So, what would justify a departure from the global baseline? And so it's kind of our little playbook, our rule book. And so that being such an important process-oriented decision-making document is also out for public comment, because it's going to be foundational for future standard setting by the CSSB. So we do not want people to brush past that in their rush to get to the exposure drafts. Look at that document as well. So the other two documents that are out are the exposure drafts for sustainability-related and climate-related disclosure. And so we're looking for the public to comment on any or all of these documents, and they're not onerous. I have to say that. The board has really tried to keep the questions to a manageable number, and it has provided context in plain language. So it will help respondents understand what's being asked and why. And we're looking to receive feedback from capital market participants, yes, but also from non-capital market perspectives. Because, I mean, the mandate of the CSSB is to serve the public interest. And we need to recognize that, yes, there are investors and companies or preparers or issuers, but there's also a public out there that's being affected by, for example, the effects of climate change and so on. So we want to hear from academia, we want to hear from think tanks, we want to hear from NGOs, as well as capital market participants. My last little drive there, because the deadline is the 10th of June. The way that you can respond, we can follow up with the link, as you say. You can either be heard through an online survey, which helps us analyze the data nice and quickly, or you can upload sort of a more traditional letter.
Yep, excellent. Wonderful. Thank you, Lisa. And so a week, tough, but doable in terms of a response. So please, if you haven't already, please consider responding to the consultation. I'd now like to, in the sort of final part of our conversation today, is sort of look at some of the sort of bigger implications of the standardization we've been discussing both internationally and in Canada. The first question is, now we actually have the sort of standards, the first ISSB standards published and the CSSB standards sort of close, in close proximity. In terms of that sort of big goal of helping investors make better decisions, more informed decisions that ultimately drive change in the market, how close are we there? How close are we to sort of achieving that sort of big goal? Maybe Michael, I'll go to you first on this one.
Well, I'm not sure we can answer that question, with data at this point, Matthew. But I think, the underlying philosophy that you just articulated is that, decisions can't be made without high quality, comparable, assured information and data. And that's what, we're heading towards now. That's what the global baseline is all about. And so I'll say two things that, we now, and it's less than a year since the release of S1 and S2, we have more than 20 jurisdictions around the world, including Canada, of course, that are on the path to adoption. They represent 55% of GDP, 40% of market cap, et cetera. So major jurisdictions that are saying, we need this information. Like IOSCO said in its endorsement of the ISSB standards, these are fit for purpose for capital markets. This is clearly what we've heard from the market. So, what investors have been saying, what preparers have been saying is this is information that the market needs. Again, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating to see how it may affect asset decision making. But what's interesting is, and I think it's related, is that we've seen take up by jurisdictions in less developed economies, to put it maybe not so eloquently. So if you look across Asia, if you look at Africa, Nigeria, and other jurisdictions, you look at Brazil, which was, I think, first off the mark in regards to its endorsement and adoption announcements in regards to the standards. Those jurisdictions are embracing the ISSB standards because they feel it puts them on a level playing field, that they will now be, their companies will be providing the information that investors globally need. And we have built proportionality into and scalability into the guidelines, which gives them some comfort. But their raison d'etre, what's really underpinning their support for the ISSB standards, is they believe that this will increase capital flows into those countries because, again, now there'll be a level playing field in regards to the information that's available with respect to investors. So again, will this happen? Too early to tell, but I can tell you from the perspective of leaders in those jurisdictions that maybe haven't seen the level of asset inflows and investment, especially to finance transition and those types of things, they definitely see the ISSB standards, that global baseline, as a tool that will help them, address that challenge and hopefully, see a difference. So, when we have a follow-up to this seminar or webinar in 12 months and 24 months, I think we will be able to answer that question with more information at hand.
You anticipated my next question, Michael, what that sort of timing is that we'll start to see the sort of impact. So no, let's set the date and have that discussion in 2 years' time. Lisa, your view on this? What's your perspective on this sort of shifting capital allocation decisions?
I think I'm going to be short and sweet here, maybe 3 sentences max, because I do feel, and I'm going to be answering this at a philosophical level as well. So in terms of financial allocation, I am optimistic that these standards will drive improvements. How could they not? If investors are getting greater insight into performance and risk metrics, there's greater transparency into, the viability of business models, into the risk profile, so on and so forth. How could it not make better decisions? And touching on one of the points that Michael mentioned, I do think that the quality and the assurance that part is going to evolve over time. So in terms of when we can say, okay, tick that box, we've accomplished this, I think quality and assurance are going to be some important components here.
So let's maybe sort of shift a bit broader, and we've sort of already sort of touched on this. And Michael mentioned that the ISSB was originally launched at COP26 in Glasgow in 2021. And that particular COP, there was a sort of big focus on the role that the financial system needs to play in transitioning the economy to deal with the sort of existential risks we face around climate and biodiversity loss. Looking at that sort of bigger picture, and again, it's probably too early to say, but now that we're starting to have this sort of consistent sort of data baseline to sort of drive that, is this a key sort of step on that process, or are there more things we needed to be looking at to drive that wider transition? Nadine, maybe I'll go to you first on that one.
Well, the immediate reaction was, where there's resistance, and where that resistance to, let's say, a sort of the bigger scale of this is a resistance to sustainability discourse or ESG discourse that presents some misunderstandings. It may feed in misinformation, disinformation. There's so many avenues by which we receive information, and maybe not as many that feel verified, which is why this project is so important. We need that confidence in the information. So I think maybe this is the philosophical portion of the webinar, where you know what you're hoping for, good dialogue. Projects like this build focus attention into the calculations that are needed, right, for disclosure. If we know that annual reporting, let me say something different. I say income statements and balance sheets, they don't grow on trees. They did not. They're not natural to the environment. They are social processes where we decide on what we count. And because those social processes are happening right now in our society, accounting is ahead and behind, right? It's these iterations of that's happening as there are tectonic shifts in what we want to value as people, as a society. So I don't know how maybe far I'm going away from what you're thinking about, but I think about I so often think about how do we build good spaces for dialogue on this topic to soften the resistance that closes people off from even trying to understand, right? Human beings, they don't like to feel stupid. And we have all, like you said, an alphabet soup when there's so much new language, so much new terminology, and very scary mathematics around climate and risks and new models we need. I think it's also recognizing how much sometimes that resistance comes from places of insecurity and confusion, and how instrumental communication is going to be to this as well. Maybe one other quick thought that came from earlier is like corporate governance is also used competitively between nations. And I remember thinking about that. So to Michael's point earlier about we're seeing early adopters from emerging regions, why wouldn't they use strengthened corporate governance as a competitive advantage for capital flows, right? Not just capital allocation as we think of it in the North American context, but flows of funds where, we know in 50 years, the majority of our population is in a continent that it is not currently, right? These are realities about the shifts in the global marketplace. And yeah, for me, 30 years ago, it was the UK trying to be competitive as it deregulated its markets. To be competitive with North American markets, we're now thinking about competitive markets and how they use corporate governance to support that in a lot of different geographic spaces. So that's me emptying my brain from a couple different things that just came up, and I will hand the floor back to you, Matthew.
Michael, Lisa, anything on that sort of bigger transition question?
No way I'm going to follow that. My goodness, that was outstanding. I mean, I guess all I would say is that I think your first question leads into the second question, which is if we can enhance the financial allocations that the capital is going to those companies that are taking this seriously and going through behavioral change and governance reform, then I think that sets the stage for that broader economic transition. I do think that's obviously going to be a longer term haul, but we have to start somewhere, and we have to start sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to this is that there's no question that there is I would say a meaningful shift to the recognition that while accounting counts a lot of things, it doesn't count all the things that, or it doesn't capture all the things that count. And that goes to your question about transition, like whether investors are thinking about it as systemic risk or preparers thinking about it as, how to deal with issues they don't feel they can, manage alone. Like the basis for this is good information. People cannot make decisions to even begin to get their arms around an issue without good information. So I think when we talk about disclosure, Lisa talked about herself as being, a standards or disclosure nerd. That's the starting point, right? And Nadine talked about this too. You simply, so this is the beginning of a journey, but the beginning of the journey is meaningful because it's a recognition by those that count that disclosures now have to encompass and connect financial and the broader sustainability. And that is a trend that is moving in one direction, and it's not slowing down.
Speaking to that trend, one of the other interesting developments that's sort of happening in parallel, we've been primarily talking about voluntary disclosures to capital markets, but there's obviously a lot of movement happening on the regulatory disclosure side with a bunch of new regulations and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in Europe, the new SEC rules, and also movement here in Canada, the B15 guidelines around climate disclosures for federally regulated financial institutions. I'd like to hear from the panel, how should we place this thinking on voluntary disclosures with those regulatory developments? Are they complementary? Are they going to compete? How would you sort of narrate that sort of pathway forward? Lisa.
Awesome, thank you. So I absolutely hope that there's going to be no competition. That I don't think serves anyone well to have competing sort of framework, standards, rules, whatever you want to call it. So being Canada focused, I'm going to confine my my comments just to our market. The strong hope is that that our evolving regulatory requirements would point to the Canadian Sustainability Disclosure Standards. Again, these standards will have had the benefit of being rooted in international standards, but have received review by a Canadian body committed to serving the Canadian public interest. And they will have been vetted. Any proposals will have been vetted by the Canadian market. So I do think, biases aside, because I'm clearly biased, but I do think that pointing to the CSSB standards does make a lot of sense from a rulemaking perspective.
Yes. Yeah. Michael, what's your view on this?
Yeah, well, I just think we're moving out of a voluntary environment to a mandatory environment, and there's strong, I would say, pressure for alignment. So there was a question there about, is convergence even possible? Well, you have to recognize that different jurisdictions may have different public policy mandates, but that common information need for investors, I'll go back to that, is common across the globe. So, I mean, look, in Canada, I mean, I'll just echo what Lisa said. CSSB recommendations will be reviewed by the Canadian Securities Administrators. One would hope that, those recommendations remain aligned with global standards. The Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, which you mentioned on its climate disclosure, has aligned now with the ISSB. We'll obviously pay close attention to what comes out of the CSSB. And we're seeing, again, countries around the world going in the direction of alignment. I mean, China, which initially had talked about the need for localized disclosure standards for sustainability risks and opportunities and so on, just announced that they're changing course. right? And the Ministry of Finance in China has just announced that its new sustainability disclosure guidelines, which will be countrywide, will be very much aligned with S1 and S2. So this is the momentum we're seeing in the market that will become mandatory. So, you know, again, I think the voluntary disclosures are a thing of a past. I think, again, as we look forward, it's going to be mandatory disclosures at securities level, at the prudential, supervisory, the you know, those levels as well. I think that's clearly the direction of travel.
Maybe to sort of conclude the discussion on the other side of the transaction for reporting organizations, now that we have sort of visibility on the standards, what are the main, you know, a lot of organizations have been reporting this type of information for a long time. Are there substantial differences around how reporters need to think about the disclosures with these new standards in place? Maybe Nadine first. No?
Nope. That one's going straight over to Lisa first.
Oh, all right. Okay. So the most significant implications, I do think that there's a different mindset here. There's more of a connecting the dots. I think this is a shift in paradigm to traditional financial accounting, financial reporting. You know, we've touched on earlier some of the impact side of the equation. A company needs to connect the dots. So, okay, yes, that's an impact, but actually, how do we tie that back? What does that mean for our business model, the viability of our longer term business model? What does that mean for our risk profile, for our strategy? I do think it's a different mindset, a different way of thinking. So I actually think that that's going to be one of the more significant implications in terms of those who are used to a traditional way of thinking.
Yeah.
Systems thinking is the wording I was looking for, systems thinking.
And in a very real sense, I mean, the ISSB standards are a game changer. We've talked about the shift from voluntary to mandatory, which creates, you know, assurance, auditing, quality assurance, and all of those things. And we're seeing preparers already adjusting to that, both at the strategic level of discussions at the board, but then how sustainability and financial reporting are lining up within, you know, the audit and risk function of companies in that reporting. But the other thing is timing of reporting. You know, traditionally sustainability reporting has lagged. And if you look at the ISSB, the expectation is that those reports will come out simultaneously in regards to timing. I mean, investors have clearly said it's no good to us to get the sustainability information 6 months after the financial. And that goes to what Lisa was saying about connectivity. From the ISSB perspective, it's not just about the disclosure of material sustainability related risks and opportunities. It's connecting them with the financial statements and, you know, the current and anticipated financial effects of those risks and opportunities. So, you know, there's a steep learning curve here across jurisdictions, across entities, but, you know, again, mandatory reporting environment, the connectivity on the financial side, the timing of these are all differences that investors expect, and preparers and assurance providers and other consultants are now gearing up, training, educating, building capacity to be able to move forward in this new regime.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael. That feels like a nice sort of summary and tying together a very rich and very interesting conversation on a very live topic for business and finance, both here in Canada and globally. I want to thank our panelists for being so open with their reflections and observations. And obviously, it's such a privilege to have these insights from the heart of these processes. A quick reminder that about the CSSB consultation, we'll provide some more information on that as part of the post-meeting materials. Just a final thought. Thank you for being part of the ESG series, this first round, where we're focused on, I think, two of the sort of the current agenda, the current state of play in this discussion on disclosure standards. Our current thinking on future events in this series, we're going to look at some of the sort of future emerging agendas, possibly looking at nature disclosures and the regeneration agenda, and also a deep dive into the S part of ESG, which is often the bit that many organizations and institutions struggle the most with. So look out for that. We'll be actually surveying this audience to sort of get your sort of feedback on future events in this session, probably for the fall. So thank you very much. Thank you again to our speakers, and wishing you a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.